January 6, 2021, hundreds of Donald Trump supporters stormed the Capitol to stop the certification of President Joe Biden's election. Tonight, the House Select Committee investigating what led to January 6 is kicking off the first of its public hearings. More than 500 days have passed since that violent and deadly insurrection. So we'll start tonight's special coverage by taking a look back at how that day unfolded with PBS NewsHour's Amna Nawaz.
USA! USA!
1 year ago, Trump supporters from across the country gathered in the nation's capital to protest Congress's certification of the 2020 presidential election results.
To use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal.
At a rally near the White House, President Trump spoke to a crowd estimated in the thousands, everyone from ordinary Americans to conspiracy theorists to members of right-wing extremist groups.
We will never give up. We will never concede.
Trump repeated the lie that the election was stolen, urging his supporters to march to the Capitol and fight.
You'll never take back our country with weakness. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Around 1 p.m., as Trump is wrapping up his remarks in the park, the day turned violent. A group of his supporters on the western side of the Capitol confront the handful of police guarding the barriers and force their way through. Moments after Mr. Trump finished his more than hour-long speech, thousands of protesters streamed from that rally site and walked this route, down Pennsylvania Avenue, directly to the U.S. Capitol grounds. Several people told us that day they expected Vice President Pence to overturn the 2020 election results.
What needs to happen today is Vice President Pence needs to not open the 7 state electors' envelopes for the states that I mentioned. Set them aside and send it all back to those state legislatures.
Well, we got to stop this steal from happening because if we don't, nobody's ever going to vote again. There's not going to be any integrity in our voting systems.
As the crowd grows, clashes between Trump supporters and Capitol police officers, clearly outnumbered, intensified.
We're not going to take it anymore. This is our country.
Outside, the Capitol's west front became a battleground. Inside, the joint session of Congress to certify election results was underway. The traditionally ceremonial process is upended by Republicans, led by Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona and Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, challenging Trump's loss, sending lawmakers to their separate chambers to debate.
What does it say to the nearly half the country that believes this election was rigged if we vote not even to consider the claims of illegality and fraud in this election?
Meanwhile, around 2 p.m., the east side barricades are breached. Here's what I saw from outside the Capitol.
Half an hour ago, vehicle barriers that had been set up a good 100 yards away or so from the Capitol were first breached by a group of protesters. Capitol Hill police retreated a little bit more. Then hundreds more protesters started to stream up this walkway in front of the Capitol. It is a remarkable scene.
On the west front, the mob tore down scaffolding, battled their way through the last line of police defense, and broke into the Capitol building itself. NewsHour congressional correspondent Lisa Desjardins was inside the building reporting live as it happened.
Judy, there are protesters. Protesters have now broken into the U.S. Capitol.
And it will stand in recess until the call of the chair.
The Senate was called into recess and evacuated. The mob of Trump supporters roamed the historic halls, damaging property and searching for lawmakers. Security footage captured the moment Capitol Police Officer Eugene Goodman shuttled Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah to safety before running ahead to divert the approaching mob away from the Senate chamber. Rioters came within 100 feet of Vice President Mike Pence, whose security detail took him to safety from an office near the Senate. While this was happening, at 2:24 p.m., Trump tweeted from the White House, criticizing Pence for not having, quote, the courage to do what should have been done. Remarkably, the House was still in session when rioters attempted to break into that chamber. A police officer shot Ashley Babbitt, an Air Force veteran from California and QAnon conspiracy theorist, as she and a crowd tried to break into the rear of the chamber where some lawmakers were still sheltering. According to an analysis from the New York Times, rioters breached the Capitol in at least 8 different places. They entered the Rotunda, Statuary Hall, and the Senate chamber. Some broke into the offices of lawmakers, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's. Law enforcement arrived to clear a hallway above Statuary Hall, where NewsHour correspondent Lisa Desjardins was sheltered.
But I do hear shouting as police seem to one by one be taking down the protesters, telling them to get on the ground, trying to control the situation.
Democratic Senator Patty Murray from Washington State spoke with Judy Woodruff about hiding in her office with her husband that day.
And we heard somebody saying, we saw them, they're in one of these rooms. And they were pounding on our door and trying to open it. And my husband sat with his foot against the door, praying that it would not break in.
Meanwhile, outside, as the crowds grew, so did the violence. Officers on site continued to call for backup throughout the day. And while some reinforcements did arrive from local and state and federal agencies, it took National Guard units about 3 hours to respond to the Capitol. Rioters, outnumbering law enforcement by more than 50 to 1, attacked, dragged, and beat police officers, crushing them underfoot and spraying them with chemicals.
They began to beat me with their fists and with what felt like hard metal objects.
In testimony to Congress, former D.C. Metro Police officer Michael Fanone recounted being pulled into a crowd of protesters.
I was electrocuted again and again and again with a taser.
This is our Capitol!
In total, nearly 150 police officers were injured on the day. During the attack, those closest to President Trump privately urged him to take action and tell his supporters to stop the assault. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy spoke with him from the besieged Capitol. His son, Donald Trump Jr., and several Fox hosts texted White House contacts to tell Trump to address the crowd. Hours passed before President Trump did anything to address the insurrection. Just after 4 p.m., he released a video repeating unfounded claims about the election results.
I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace.
Around this time, police began to secure the Capitol. Flashbangs and tear gas were used to clear the Western Terrace, the site of presidential inaugurations. Police declared the Capitol complex secure around 8 p.m.
To those who wreaked havoc in our Capitol today, you did not win.
In the early hours of the next day, January 7th, Congress finished certifying the election results. Some Senate Republicans withdrew their initial objections.
The chair declares the joint session dissolved.
A Capitol police officer, Brian Sicknick, suffered 2 strokes and died that evening. In the days and months following the attack, 4 police officers who were on duty died by suicide. More than 720 people have been arrested and charged with crimes linked to January 6th. The physical destruction of that day has since been cleaned up, but questions of how to repair the deeper damage to our democracy remain. For the PBS NewsHour in Washington, I'm Amna Nawaz.
Capitol and D.C. Metropolitan Police were on the front lines of the insurrection that day. Many paid a physical and psychological price. One police officer died a day later from multiple strokes. 4 others died by suicide in the months that followed. A year after the attack, the NewsHour's Lisa Desjardins spoke with 2 Capitol police officers on the lingering effects and anger in the wake of January 6th.
Some officers, like U.S. Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn, are still recovering from the emotional scars of that day. Others, like Capitol Police Sergeant Aquilino Gonell, are still recovering from the physical toll. Gonell recently tweeted out graphic photos showing the gashes and bruises from crushing and other injuries to his shoulder, to his hands, and to his foot. Dunn and Gonell co-wrote this op-ed today for the Washington Post, demanding accountability for the Capitol riot. Officer Harry Dunn and Sergeant Aquilino Gonell join me now. Thank you both so much for protecting the Capitol, me personally, and thank you for joining us now. And I want to start first off with that op-ed. You had strong words in that. One sentence that you wrote was this. You wrote, "It will not be enough to identify and punish only those who physically attacked the Capitol and tried to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power." Those are strong words. Sergeant Gonell, who do you mean there, and what do you want to happen in terms of that accountability?
Oh, there's a lot of people who are involved with what transpired on January 6th, including some of the elected officials that even after we put our bodies at risk of injuries and even death, like Officer Signey, they continue to downplay this tragic, horrific event of January 6th. And it's mind-boggling that what they do, trying to downplay everything.
It sounds like you're talking about politicians. Is that right? Being held more accountable.
Elected officials that on January 6th, on January 7th, they all knew where to put the blame and point the finger at. They all knew that the president for almost 3 hours did not do his job. And it pains me that 16 blocks away, he was watching everything on TV, despite the horrific images that were coming live on TV. I didn't see on TV, but I'm sure by then everybody around the country were watching it with their own eyes, as I was battling those people in the lower west entrance, as people know it now, the tunnel.
You're talking about the former president, and former President Trump put out a statement just in the last few weeks calling what happened on January 6th an unarmed protest. Also, at one point, Officer Dunn, Fox News host Tucker Carlson, called you a, quote, angry left-wing activist. This is the battle now, a battle of words over what happened on January 6th. And Officer Dunn, I want to ask you, how do you respond to people who say that your accounts and the way people look at it are exaggerated and perhaps it wasn't that bad?
Angry left-wing activist. When I heard that, I had to stop and think about it for a little bit. It's fair to say I am angry. I'm a registered Democrat, so I guess I'm a left-wing. And if activist means somebody who's standing up for what's right and fighting for what they believe in, then sure, I'll be that. But outside of that, I don't have any response to him or anybody over at that network, because it just seems like they like to talk about people and not to people. So if they're interested in having an actual conversation about the facts about what happened that day, I'd be happy to talk to them. But until then, I'm just going to keep on talking to people that matter and fighting for accountability and justice for what happened that day.
If I may, I mean, you're talking about people who never raise their hand to say, hey, I don't solemnly swear to protect and defend this country and the Constitution. They never done that. So they are talking from their office and in comfort, despite us doing the hard work and protecting and serving something that they never thought about doing themselves, both as a police officer or as a military person.
You wrote in your op-ed that you feel there is an effort to whitewash what happened on January 6th. What do you mean by that, Officer Dunn?
You know, just a simple downplaying. Just like recently, I wasn't aware that what the former president's statement was that you just quoted. I wasn't aware of that statement, but I guess that's the perfect definition to the answer to your question about what they're trying to whitewash it, and an unarmed demonstration. I would like to refer to it as a terrorist attack. I went through it, and a lot of my coworkers physically hurt still to this day, 1 year later. And there's so much that we do not know about what happened that day. And we're starting to find out more and more about what happened that day. So I think we just need to continue to sit back and let all the facts come out. And it will no longer be people's opinions that are valid once all the facts are out on the table. So
I'm interested in talking to both of you. First, you, Sergeant Gonell, about why you think January 6th happened. You saw the faces of your fellow Americans attacking you. Why do you think, what was driving them? What's going on here, Sergeant?
During the last almost 5 years, we have an individual telling a lot of people, the system is rigged. If I lose, but if I win, it's okay. Everything is okay. And people are susceptible to lies. And the way that he was amplifying it made it even worse. Coupling that with the type of charges that some of these insurrectionists are getting, and people can see that as a way to explain it to themselves and say, you know what, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't as horrific as they say, but it was horrific. If you were in the entrance of the Lower West Terrace, it was do or die. It was, these people were trying to hurt officer in fully clothed police uniform.
Officer Dunn, do you think this danger is still here? Where are we right now in terms of the threat to democracy, from your view?
You know, it's scary to think about where we are. Like, sure, we succeeded as far as our mission that day. Democracy went on late in the night, January 6th into January 7th. Democracy prevailed. But I think it's very important for everybody now to realize how close and fragile democracy is, and that everybody, even anybody watching, anybody listening, has a job to do in protecting and defending democracy. That could be us police officers, we police, the legislators, the lawmakers, they need to do their job and legislate. The judges judge, and the American people need to vote about who to put into those positions. That we need accountability, and we need to make sure the right people are in office that want accountability also.
How's the police force doing? How is the U.S. Capitol Police Force doing? I know there have been improvements they announced today, more equipment, but we also know that some 200 officers have left since January 6th. The recruiting is tough. Officer Dunn, how's the police force?
You know, I don't really want to speak for everybody else, so I'll just speak on some things that I know. We're still hurting. A lot of people are struggling with what happened. I'm still upset, but I'm recovering. I'm starting to heal, but I don't think total healing can happen until accountability has been had. So,
Sergeant Gonell, how are you doing?
I'm okay. I mean, there are days things comes in waves. I hit you left and right. There are times that I'm okay for a minute, then something, a word or a sound or a smell will trigger some of the things that happened back at work on that day. And going back to the question that you posed to Harry, the former president still wields a lot of influence over these people, and I'm worried that in the future he could just tweet something or make a statement, and the same people who were on January 6, 2021, they could end up back at the Capitol. Yes, we have made a lot of improvement. Yes, we have a lot of training, but the forces that culminated on January 6, they're still in place, and that's why we need accountability. That's why we want to hold those responsible.
I know you both were facing the thick of the fighting, and we talk a lot about the difficulties of that day, but I also know you found some bright spots in the hundreds of letters and tweets of support, and I just have to thank you all for speaking to us tonight. Officers Harry Dunn and Sergeant Aquilino Gonell, thank you.
Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick died one day after being attacked during the insurrection, while trying to protect the building itself and the lawmakers inside it. A year after his death, Judy Woodruff spoke with Sandra Garza, his partner of 11 years, about Sicknick's legacy and who she believes should be held accountable for his death.
Sandra Garza, thank you so much for joining us to talk about something so personal to you. Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, Brian was just one of the sweetest, kindest men I've ever met. And I know that sounds so cliche, when a loved one or someone that you care about so much passes away, for people to say, oh, they were the kindest, sweetest, person I've ever met. But it really was true. And I mean, to really emphasize how true that was about Brian, even the investigators who were investigating Brian's death, because it took, 3.5 months to find out what caused his death. They actually said to me that they could not find one person, not one single soul, to say anything negative about Brian. That's how well liked and how good of a person that he was. Brian got along with everybody. He was just a warm, loving person. And so it really hurt me a lot to know that he suffered greatly before his death. So,
and we know
he was a good person.
I know some people have looked at what happened, they've read a little about it, and they've questioned the connection between what happened to him. As we mentioned, he was sprayed with a chemical substance. Then he suffered 2 strokes. He died the next day. Some people have questioned the connection, but you've said there's no doubt in your mind that it was what happened in that riot that led to his death.
Well, I've said that I accepted the medical examiner's conclusion and their report. But what I will say is the medical examiner did say that all that transpired that day definitely played a role in kind of escalating or tipping the scales to escalate his death. And I agree with that, and I hope I'm not, misquoting the medical examiner. But, I mean, that's pretty much how I see it. Brian was running from one end of the Capitol to the other end of the Capitol. He was exerting himself, and, he was attacked. All of those factors combined, and being highly stressed, producing a lot of adrenaline and cortisol in the body, worrying about his colleagues as well as himself. I mean, I know if I was approached by thousands of people and there was only, 3 or 4 officers next to me, and they're screaming at me and throwing things at me and assaulting me, I'd be pretty darn stressed. I think definitely that played a role in tipping the scales for him to pass away much faster.
Brian we know now, Brian had been a supporter of former President Trump. He had opposed his first impeachment. But then, of course, these events took place. Who do you hold responsible? To what extent do you hold the former president responsible for this?
I hold Donald Trump 100% responsible for what happened on January 6th, and all of the people that have enabled him that day and continue to enable him now. But definitely, yes. And I think, sadly, Brian did not live long enough to see the evidence that has come forth to show what kind of man Donald Trump really is. Clearly, he doesn't support law enforcement. I mean, he watched for hours law enforcement being pummeled and beaten, attacked, and he did nothing. Later, we had 4 officers kill themselves because of the events of that day, the stressors that they experienced. And of course, the last 2 officers, sadly, that committed suicide, we don't know all the factors that, combined that caused them to take their lives. But clearly, we know that January 6th was a terrible event. And I think that, coupled with maybe other stressors in their life, certainly played a role. And I think Brian would be horrified. I think he would have viewed Donald Trump in a very different light. And of course, on that day, all the officers were in their respective areas. It was only after the event that they got to see all of the footage from that day, that they got to see what, their colleagues on the other end of the Capitol were experiencing. So I think they were horrified, yeah.
And you're right, it has taken a long time for many of those details, for the video, pieces of the story to come together. How do you think the former president should be held accountable?
Personally, for me, I think he needs to be in prison. That's what I think. But, you know, Donald Trump has been playing these legal wrangling games for decades. You know, he knows how to skirt the system. You know, he knows how to, he's a very litigious person, you know, himself. And then when he's been sued, he knows how to, you know, play these games to get around things and avoid jail and prison time. So, you know, that's the sad piece. But it would be very, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Satisfying to me to see him in prison. You know, I don't regret for voting for Trump. I identify as an independent, by the way. Brian was a Republican. But, you know, the horrific thing that he did on the 6th is unforgivable. And, you know, it's terrible. Yeah, he's just a horrible person. And he still has not contacted me, by the way.
He has not been in touch with you?
No, no. He doesn't have the courage or the spine to do it. He just doesn't.
One other thing, what do you say to or think of the members of Congress? Most Republican members of Congress are saying, in effect, let's move on. January the 6th happened. It's in the past. We need to focus on the future.
Yeah, what I would say to that is Trump is the type of man who incites violence. And, you know, so it's not going to stop. And if they don't stand up and say enough is enough, it's just going to continue. And sadly, I really worry about the safety of our officers still. I worry about another January 6th like attack. I mean, this is serious stuff. And they're concerned about money in their pocket and power. It's ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. They don't care about the American people. That says it right there. They care about themselves.
Well, Sandra Garza, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Judy. I really appreciate you having me. It was nice speaking to you.
The January 6th attack on the Capitol was rooted in a disproved notion that Joe Biden didn't win the 2020 election. But since that day, many Republican leaders and even former President Trump himself have pushed this false narrative that the January 6th Capitol attack was either nonviolent or fueled by leftists. A year after the insurrection, the NewsHour's Amna Nawaz explored how misinformation campaigns are trying to misrepresent what happened that day.
They broke through barricades, assaulted police, smashed their way into the Capitol, and sent lawmakers into hiding. Yet even as the attack was playing out, there were already alternative narratives being spun about who was to blame.
There are some reports that Antifa sympathizers may have been sprinkled throughout the crowd.
Possibly Antifa insurrectionists possibly could have infiltrated some of these movements and maybe instigated some of this.
The Washington Times has just reported some pretty compelling evidence from a facial recognition company showing that some of the people who breached the Capitol today were not Trump supporters. They were masquerading as Trump supporters and, in fact, were members of the violent terrorist group Antifa.
Yeah, in the first hours and days afterward, you could see Trump and his allies and supporters sort of groping for what the appropriate narrative was.
David Graham is a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
So on the one hand, you had Trump, coming out with his video on the day of saying, "We love you, but now go home." But you also saw people saying, "Oh, this is agitators. It was Antifa. It was Black Lives Matter."
That despite contemporaneous texts between pundits on Fox and the White House showing they thought Trump supporters were responsible. When subsequent arrests confirmed that publicly, the narrative on the right shifted to downplay the violence that day. Here's former President Trump on Fox in March.
Right from the start, it was zero threat. Look, they went in. They shouldn't have done it. Some of them went in and they're hugging and kissing the police and the guards.
There was no insurrection, and to call it an insurrection, in my opinion, is a bold-faced lie.
Republican Congressman Andrew Clyde at a hearing in May.
You know, if you didn't know the TV footage was a video from January the 6th, you would actually think it was a normal tourist visit.
I mean, it's strange to see somebody like, Congressman Andrew Clyde, of Georgia, who we saw in videos and footage from January 6th, helping to bar the doors. suddenly saying, well, these were just tourists, they were walking through.
Another recurrent theme, shifting focus away from January 6th and towards protests for Black Lives Matter the year before. Republican Congressman Clay Higgins of Louisiana.
19 people died during BLM riots last year. Hundreds and hundreds were injured. 2,000 police officers were injured from BLM riots last year.
Voices on the right have also recast those awaiting trial for their part in the attack as political prisoners. Here's Republican Congressman Paul Gosar of Arizona last month.
These are dads, brothers, veterans, teachers. All political prisoners who continue to be persecuted and endure the pain of unjust suffering.
So too with the death of Ashley Babbitt, the Air Force veteran shot by Capitol Police as she attempted to breach the Speaker's lobby. Here's Republican Representative Jody Hice of Georgia in May.
In fact, it was Trump supporters who lost their lives that day, not Trump supporters who were taking the lives of others.
Former President Trump reinforced that in a July interview on Fox.
Who was the person that shot an innocent, wonderful, incredible woman, a military woman?
The idea that they were all motivated by these good intentions. They believed the election was stolen, which of course was false. It was a lie that had been peddled to them by the president and many of his allies. But they were going in and they wanted to stand up for what was right. That they were sort of like the American revolutionaries or like, the Confederate rebels who wanted to really uphold the best of the Constitution.
In an October piece in The Atlantic, Graham explored this idea, how those who committed criminal acts to stop a democratic process have been recast by the far right as heroes, patriots, and martyrs for a just cause, much like the Confederate soldiers celebrated by the mythology of the lost cause.
The fact that those people are referred to by some in these circles as patriots, what does that do to the narrative?
It makes them into the heirs of what was right. It turns something that was one of the darker moments in American history into one of the brighter ones, into a moment of unity and rebellion against what's wrong and standing up for what's right, which I think is really dangerous. If we can turn something that's an assault on a constitutional process into a moment of triumph and a moment of a sort of lodestar for what's to come, I think that doesn't bode well for American democracy.
These efforts could be working. An NPR NewsHour Marist poll conducted last month showed a sharp partisan divide over how Americans view what happened on January 6th, the legitimacy of investigations into it, and decreasing blame for President Trump, even as the former president continues to push the lie at the heart of January 6th.
The durability of that lie, where does that fit into sort of the larger misinformation campaign, the very thing that brought people out on January 6th in the first place?
Well, it's essential to the legitimacy of Trump as a political actor today. If he's somebody who had the election stolen from him, that makes him still a sort of heroic figure and a more legitimate leader, perhaps, than Joe Biden in the eyes of his supporters. And that enables a lot of other information.
Information, or more accurately, misinformation, questioning or undermining everything from measures to stop the spread of COVID-19 to the safety and efficacy of vaccines, from bogus stories about vaccines tracking and controlling Americans to campaigns to stop teachers from talking about race or racism in schools.
So when people in the Trumpist orbit spread misinformation about Joe Biden, or they spread misinformation about vaccines or about COVID, all of these spring from his legitimacy as, the real elected leader, which depends on the lie of the election being stolen.
The effects of January 6th ripple beyond Washington, D.C. and into the heart of American politics and culture. It's also prompted experts and historians to watch closely to see where America and its democracy is headed. I spoke about this with Julian Zelizer, Princeton University professor of political history and author of the upcoming book, The Presidency of Donald J. Trump, a first historical assessment. Trump's messaging that the election was stolen was a catalyst for the insurrection, and some of his followers and politicians still believe that rhetoric. How has that affected or impacted our democracy?
Well, it's very damaging to see the normalization of an effort to overturn the election. And the rhetoric that the former president used, which was the basis of the challenge and the basis of the people who were part of the insurrection on January 6th, is now just part of our public conversation in certain quarters of the electorate, and it's dangerous. The idea that the loser of an election doesn't have to accept the loss is fundamentally dangerous, because a democratic process depends on that, and it depends on the peaceful transfer of power that follows that kind of concession. Those who are part of this movement, part of this effort within the GOP, are essentially playing the long game. January 6th was just one piece of a much larger strategy, and we're seeing that now play out with elected officials, candidates running for office who subscribe to election denialism. They are in agreement with voting restrictions, and they are prepared in future elections to challenge legitimate results. And so if all of that happens and these officials find themselves in power, we need to anticipate that the next time 2020 happens, the outcome could be very different. And we saw in 2020 how a few officials in just a few states like Georgia and Michigan, if they had not done the right thing, it was possible that legitimate results wouldn't have been counted. And so this is a serious threat, not just a rhetorical threat, to the stability of our democratic system.
This messaging and this belief has also led to stricter voting laws in different states, poll workers being harassed. What can voters do about that?
There's three parts of this. One is the rhetoric about election denialism. Two are laws that actually now limit the vote or make it more difficult to vote. And third are efforts to manipulate the actual machinery of our elections, from threats to local poll workers to efforts to stack local party officials and election officials with partisan figures. And so what can voters do? One is to really demand legislative solutions from their representatives and senators to prevent this. They really need to pressure legislators to see this as an issue where no is not an acceptable answer. If that doesn't happen, I fear this will only disintegrate and get worse over time rather than better.
How do you think this will impact the midterms?
Well, it's a good question, and election denialism, like other issues, they compete for attention, and so other issues also are concerning the electorate, the economy, events overseas, and more. But what we're seeing in the Republican Party is that pretty rapidly, this is becoming a unifying theme for a lot of Republicans. It's kind of like the anti-communism of 1980, which was an issue that Ronald Reagan used to unify different parts of the GOP. Now the idea of voting fraud and problems with the election and rigged systems, this is something many, many Republicans are signing on to, even those who are not endorsed by the former president. So it's becoming a campaign theme. And when you have that, you invest candidates, you invest politicians in following through with that after the election. So I think we're going to continue to hear a lot of it in the midterms. It's now a rallying cry in the Republican Party as much as almost any other issue.
Has anything like this ever happened before in American history?
Yeah, unfortunately, the history of voting, the history of democracy is much more fragile than we think. We didn't have a full democracy, really, until the mid-1960s at best, when that voting rights legislation passed. But if you look back, for example, to the early 20th century, the period after Reconstruction, this is when in many southern states, Jim Crow laws were used to prevent voting from happening. Often threats or fears of mass voting fraud were used to support the disenfranchisement of Black Americans, and the entire machinery of elections in the South was broken. We didn't have a democratic system in the South. Reconstruction was undermined. The promise of the vote was undermined by what those southern states did. So that should be reason for more concern, meaning this is not a democracy that always lived up to its ideals. In fact, just the opposite. And so there's a foundation, there's precedent for what's going on right now, which means it's more likely to continue.
This committee has invested a lot of resources into this investigation, despite the fact that they won't be able to levy any charges against any of the people that they bring forward. Why is this hearing important?
good congressional hearings where members of the panel actually help get more information about something that happened inherently is better for our country. Meaning we want to know as much as possible so that we have it on the record about what happened after the 2020 election, what happened on January 6th, who was responsible, who should be held accountable. And having that information is better than not having it. The other part of a hearing, which is much harder to predict and less likely, frankly, with the January 6th committee, is that it stimulates a political response to wrongdoing. And for many reasons, it's not that likely that the hearings, even if they produce bombshell findings, even if they're shocking to some parts of the electorate, that they're going to change the fundamental political dynamics. We saw this already. We had the second impeachment where the committee, the Congress went through the facts in dramatic fashion of what happened on that horrible day. And in the end, most Republicans have moved on. They've supported the former president. Those who were critical are the ones who've been marginalized within the party. And the public more broadly, even non-Republicans, have moved on. Sure, some are mad and angry about what happened, but it's not a priority for a lot of the electorate from what we can see. So it's going to be hard for the committee to fulfill Objective 2. But Objective 1, I would say, is still very important in the long term to our ability to make this country a better place.
What should we expect to hear or learn from these hearings? And should we expect to hear any new information?
Part of the challenge is a lot of what happened in broad daylight. The former president was not subtle about what he was doing. He said it with the TV cameras rolling. He at first used his Twitter to basically lay out the strategy, and he's continued since then. So there's no smoking gun in some ways that is going to be revealed as occurred with Watergate. I think what the committee is trying to do is understand more about the intentionality behind this whole strategy, to really look at how many Republicans behind the scenes were having discussions and part of the conversation about trying to challenge the election result. Even when Republicans, as we've seen reports, were telling the president, you need to stop, or this is going too far, or where's the evidence for what you want us to say, it kind of shows that this wasn't some random set of events that went poorly on January 6th, but there was actually a concerted buildup.
Are the vulnerabilities in our democracy that the insurrection and these hearings have revealed reparable? And how will this hearing inform or play a role in addressing some of those fissures?
The problems are reparable, and we need to remember that. We need to remind ourselves, and voters need to remember that. So you can look at the example of 1965 when Black Americans were disenfranchised, and the Jim Crow laws were still working to make it impossible for voters to register. And Congress and President Lyndon Johnson, in response to a civil rights movement, passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And from 65 until a Supreme Court decision in 2013, it made a difference. Voting rates increased. A lot of the barriers to voting dissipated, and the federal government worked to make sure that those were not permissible. Laws can actually change this. There can also be laws to protect the election from having a few, bad apples in states act against what voters wanted. So legislative solutions are important. I don't know in the end how much will the committee hearings produce more favorable conditions to those kinds of solutions, but I'm sure the panel hopes that happens. This isn't simply about blame and accountability, though it's very important. It's also about solutions. The more you understand about how this all unfolded, the more that you understand these fissures in the system, that's when you have more clarity about what Congress needs to do to make sure we're not facing this again in 2024 or 2028.
Thank you so much for your time, Julian.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The House Select Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection is gaveling in the first of at least a half dozen public hearings. Earlier today, I spoke with NewsHour's Lisa Desjardins about what she expects to see and hear from lawmakers and witnesses during these hearings. Lisa, walk us through what led to these hearings that are kicking off tonight and how significant they are to understanding what actually happened on January 6th.
And there are reasons that this has taken a year and a half to get to this point. Some of them, in fact, most of them are political. After January 6th, there was a great deal of discussion about the idea of a bipartisan commission that would have no lawmakers on it. It would be outside of Congress to do an investigation that was less tainted by politics. But the Republicans and Democrats couldn't agree on exactly how that commission should work, who should appoint staff. They basically didn't trust each other with those kinds of appointments. So in the end, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi went on her own with her Democrats to appoint a House Select Committee. That committee was intended to include some members that would be recommended by Republicans. However, Speaker Pelosi said that some of those recommendations from House Leader Kevin McCarthy were antithetical to what she thought should be happening. She didn't trust those members. You can go back and forth. Republicans have had a problem with that. But this is all a long way of saying there have been a lot of politics involved. The committee was created by an act of the House, a resolution a year ago. They've been meeting with over 1,000 witnesses, Nicole, since then. Most of those, in fact, all of those interviews have been behind closed doors. Tonight will be the first time that we hear any of the public testimony from the work that has been going on from this committee.
Lawmakers have also hinted that these hearings could potentially reveal alarming things about January 6th that we hadn't previously heard. So much so that this first hearing is during primetime television. What's the thinking behind that? And what do you think we're going to hear?
It's clear that Democrats want the nation's attention here. Democrats believe, on one hand, that there is a very real substantive danger that is present still from what happened on January 6th. They want Americans to be aware of it. They are concerned about rising anti-government rhetoric, rising use of violence as a potential way of getting political will. That is a substantive concern. At the same time, there are political currents here. Democrats believe that Republicans are still defending President Trump in a way that they are unhappy about. They want to make inroads with Americans who they believe have become complicit to President Trump, or at least have kind of shrugged off any problems they have with him. Part of their agenda here is to raise real concerns and also really raise sirens that they feel themselves about President Trump. They will charge that President Trump himself was part of a conspiracy that led to January 6th. Those are very serious charges. Of course, this is the same House that led impeachment charges against the former president as well. What will we see that's new exactly? The committee has been holding that closely to its chest because they want the hearings to be impactful. They've been very careful about not having leaks. We have seen a little bit of new video come out today. I'm not ready to describe it because I just don't know. Is it a sense of overzealousness from Democrats that they feel they have something that is really new and will change how we look at January 6th? Or is this legitimately new material that will help us understand our own country and the politics of it in a new way? I don't know. We will hear from some very high-profile witnesses in video interviews, including President Trump's own family. So certainly the possibility is there for a lot of very important moments, but I'm not ready to say yet what exactly those will be.
Speaking of witnesses, as you said, we are going to hear from several today. Who are those people and who are you most curious to hear what they have to say?
Interesting. There will be two live witnesses. That's what they're going to call them. Two witnesses that will be there in this very large, cavernous hearing room where the committee will be meeting tonight. One of them is a British documentary filmmaker. His name is Nick Quested. He especially spent time with the Proud Boys. That is, of course, that alt-right group that has been known, has been charged in the past with violent conduct. They were there on January 6th. Its leader has been charged. They've also been subpoenaed by this committee. Basically, this documentarian has footage, some of which has never been seen in public before, of what was going on in the riot, and perhaps the role of those who were consciously leading it. And I think that's what Democrats want to show, is that this was not sort of a mob that erupted haphazardly. They want to show that this was, I believe, a criminal effort, they will say, by people, including the Proud Boys, it seems,
to try and overturn an important function of government and, in fact, democracy itself. The other witness today will be a Capitol Police Officer, Caroline Edwards. She was one of the first to encounter the mob as it came to the Capitol. She was injured, and I think she will speak to the personal experience of the riot itself from that perspective.
Beyond witnesses, as you mentioned, they have also gone through thousands of documents. Where is this information coming from?
Right, 140,000 documents, we're told, or data points. Much of it is from requests that they have put out to many of the 1,000 people they've interviewed. Those include things like cell phone messages, text messages. Some of those have come to light, including text messages for Mark Meadows, the former chief of staff to former President Trump. Those have made headlines on their own. His conversations with lawmakers here on Capitol Hill, his conversations with Ginny Thomas, the wife of the Supreme Court Justice Thomas. Those are some of the documents we're talking about. A lot of phone records have been subpoenaed here as well. Some of them have just been requested. So to be honest, we're still in the dark about exactly what these documents are, but we know those are the kinds of requests that the committee has been making. And we've been asking to look at as many of those documents as we can, as well as the transcripts of the interviews themselves. Tonight, I think your viewers will really be interested to know that we will see clips, I think, of probably Trump family members in their video interviews with the committee behind closed doors. What we will not have, or what we don't think we will have, is a full transcript of those interviews yet. So this often raises a situation where one piece of sound from an interview is put out for the public, and perhaps that person, like an Ivanka Trump, a Jared Kushner, can say, you didn't play my whole interview. We are hoping, and we've been pushing for, some like me have been pushing for the full transcripts, but we don't have those yet. We don't know when or if we will get them.
This is inherently a political hearing and a politicized hearing. How do you think GOP congressional leaders are going to respond to what we learned from these hearings?
Yeah, I think we live in a time where almost every hearing of Congress is a political hearing. It is a political animal, Congress is, of course. So I completely take your point that any hearing like this is going to be political. And you have to differentiate the way that we look at politics, which is part of the deliberative process here in America. Sometimes it serves us well that we have these two political parties that go at odds with each other, just like a process in a courtroom. In this case, there's another level of that word political, which is the Republicans are going to say that this is a political hearing, meaning that it is devoid of substance. They will charge that this is nothing but an attempt to undermine their candidates, including former President Trump, his legacy, anyone who supports him. They say that this is an attempt to help Democrats at the polls in November, when we know that they face a difficult midterm election. They are nervous about losing control of the House when they have a president in the White House, President Biden, with low approval ratings. And also, this midterm election usually is one that is difficult for the party in power at the White House. So all of that is a long way of answering your question, Nicole, that this word political, I feel like we need more versions of that word, because you're right. This is a political hearing, as is almost every hearing now in its nature. But Republicans will use that word in a very specific way, essentially to charge bad faith against the Democrats. Democrats say, no, our democracy is at stake. This is something that is above politics.
Another important point here is that this is not a criminal trial. President Trump and his supporters will not be charged based on what we learn from these hearings. But it also begs the question, why are these hearings so important, and who do they matter to most?
Right. What is the point of this? You know, this was a year and a half ago. What are we doing here? There's not legislation that we expect to come out of these hearings, which is also another unusual facet of them. Part of this is just the investigative duty of Congress. And this was a security threat to Congress itself that we've never really seen before. Congress has to take this seriously. So part of it is just to make sure Congress is doing due diligence to understand the forces at work. But I think for Democrats, they really believe that the country doesn't understand the danger from this kind of political violence, that it still exists. And what they're trying to do here is change public perception That is one level. The second level is they are also building a rhetorical case for potential criminal action by the Department of Justice. This could end in some more criminal referrals. We've had a few criminal referrals, I believe 4 so far, based on people who have not cooperated with the committee. So far, 2 former Trump officials have been indicted for refusing to cooperate with this committee, indicted for contempt of Congress. The first trial of those is in July, so we don't know what courts will think of that. It's a separations of power question like we've never seen before. But Democrats could well pushing for criminal charges against other members of the Trump administration that are not just about contempt of Congress, but are about the insurrection itself. They don't have the power to levy those charges, but they're building that case here in the court of public opinion. And I believe many of them will hope that the Department of Justice acts. We don't know if it will.
Speaking of the court of public opinion, how do you think Trump will respond?
That's such a great question. Is he even watching? How can he not watch? Donald Trump, we know. Now, the only thing, there is an interesting point, though, is that we will be streaming this. Most TV networks are streaming this. The cable networks are streaming this live. The network which is not covering the hearing tonight live is Fox News, and we know that that is one of the former president's favorite channels. I would be shocked if we don't see a few emails from the former president. Certainly, we know that those of his allies here in Congress plan to have a media blitz in the next few days, pushing back at Democrats. I'm sure that former President Trump will not pause in using some of his nicknames for members of the committee who he's targeted before, like Representative Adam Schiff of California, one of his favorite kind of foes, I suppose. Nancy Pelosi, I think the House Speaker will be raised very often, perhaps by President Trump and others around him.
We have covered a lot of ground in terms of what to expect in this hearing, but what will you be watching for in this first day?
I think this is a risk and reward situation for Democrats. I'm not trying to be glib about it. There is a high risk for Democrats because I do think when you look at polling, much of the nation has moved on in terms of feeling that January 6th is an active concern. And we even saw a poll from NBC earlier this week showing that fewer Americans now seem to believe that President Trump was directly responsible. It's still a high number. It's still in the 40% range, but no longer a majority of Americans who believe President Trump was directly involved. Americans are looking at other concerns, as you've raised. Inflation is a big deal. Gas prices is a big deal. And we're dealing with a very important moment in gun violence and debate in the Senate. So I think it's a tricky finesse in a way that Democrats have to try and pull off tonight. They have to understand that the American public, by and large, is in a different place than most Democrats here in Congress who feel January 6th every day. And I'm going to be watching to see how they navigate that. Do they go big and do they go too big? Or do they sort of restrain themselves? How is it that they try to engage with the American public, who I think is in a different headspace by and large than the people here at the U.S. Capitol?
We'll certainly both be watching to see and find out. Lisa Desjardins for the PBS NewsHour, thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for joining this special digital coverage of the first of the House Select Committee's public hearings on January 6th. We now turn to Judy Woodruff and the rest of the NewsHour team for broadcast coverage of the event. I'm Nicole Ellis. Thanks for watching.
This hearing is the first of a series the committee plans to hold over the next 3 weeks. Tonight's is one of 2 that are expected to be held in TV prime time in the evening. It has been a year and a half since the January 6th attack, and there are many questions still to be answered. While the committee is technically bipartisan, with 2 Republicans joining 7 Democratic members, the House Republican leaders charge that the hearings are a partisan effort to disparage former President Donald Trump. Following the hearings tonight with me are our correspondents Lisa Desjardins at the Capitol and Jeff Bennett at the White House. And let me start with both of you. To you, Lisa, I know you've been following this as the committee has been doing its work. Tonight we are going to begin to see the results of that. Give us a sense of what we expect to see.
For the members of this committee, this is a high-stakes hearing. They think that this is about democracy itself in danger. The threat from January 6th, what they believe is still here, and they will lay out evidence from 1,000 interviews that they conducted over the past year that they say adds up to a multi-step conspiracy with former President Donald Trump at the center, which is what they will say caused January 6th. Also, Judy, interesting to note, in that cavernous room you see, it's just behind me here at the Cannon House office building, this will be a multimedia presentation with video, with documentary kind of feel to it. This will be the most highly produced congressional hearing in history.
Lisa Desjardins, and let's go quickly to the chair, Benny Thompson.
Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material presented during tonight's hearing. Thanks to everyone watching tonight for sharing part of your evening to learn the facts and causes of the events leading up to and including the violent attack on January 6, 2021. Our democracy, electoral system, and country. I'm Benny Thompson, chairman of the January 6, 2021 committee. I was born, raised, and still live in Bolton, Mississippi, a town with a population of 521, which is midway between Jackson and Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the Mississippi River. I'm from a part of the country where people justify the actions of slavery, the Ku Klux Klan, and lynching. I'm reminded of that dark history as I hear voices today try and justify the actions of the insurrectionists on January 6, 2021. Over the next few weeks, hopefully you will get to know the other members, my colleagues up here, and me. We represent a diversity of communities from all over the United States, rural areas and cities, East Coast, West Coast, and the Heartland. All of us have one thing in common. We swore the same oath. That same oath that all members of Congress take upon taking office and afterwards every 2 years if they are reelected. We swore an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The words of the current oath taken by all of us that nearly every United States government employee takes have their roots in the Civil War. Throughout our history, the United States has fought against foreign enemies to preserve our democracy, electoral system, and country. When the United States Capitol was stormed and burned in 1814, foreign enemies were responsible. Afterward, in 1862, when American citizens had taken up arms against this country, Congress adopted a new oath to help make sure no person who had supported the rebellion could hold a position of public trust. Therefore, Congresspersons and United States federal government employees were required for the first time to swear an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath was put to test on January 6, 2021. The police officers who held the line that day honored their oath. Many came out of that day bloodied and broken. They still bear those wounds, visible and invisible. They did their duty. They repelled the mob and ended the occupation of the Capitol. They defended the Constitution against domestic enemies so that Congress could return, uphold our own oath, and count your votes to ensure the transfer of power, just as we've done for hundreds of years. But unlike in 1814, it was domestic enemies of the Constitution who stormed the Capitol and occupied the Capitol, who sought to thwart the will of the people, to stop the transfer of power. And so they did, so at the encouragement of the President of the United States. The President of the United States trying to stop the transfer of power, a precedent that had stood for 220 years, even as our democracy had faced its most difficult tests. Thinking back again to the Civil War in the summer of 1864, the President of the United States believed we would be doomed to his bid for re-election. He believed his opponent, General George McClellan, would wave the white flag when it came to preserving the Union. But even with that grim fate hanging in the balance, President Lincoln was ready to accept the will of the voters, come what may. He made a quiet pledge. He wrote down the words, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect. It will be my duty." Lincoln sealed that memo and asked his cabinet secretaries to sign it sight unseen. He asked them to make the same commitment he did, to accept defeat if indeed defeat was the will of the people, to uphold the rule of law, to do what every president who came before him did and what every president who followed him would do, until Donald Trump. Donald Trump lost the presidential election in 2020. The American people voted him out of office. It was not because of a rigged system. It was not because of voter fraud. Don't believe me? Hear what his former Attorney General had to say about it. I warn those who watching that this contains strong language.
No, just what I've been through. I had 3 discussions with the president that I can recall. One was on November 23rd, one was on December 1st, and one was on December 14th. And I've been through sort of the give and take of those discussions. And in that context, I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit. And, you know, I didn't want to be a part of it, and that's one of the reasons that went into me deciding to leave when I did. I observed, I think it was on December 1st, that, you know, how can you can't live in a world where the incumbent administration stays in power based on its view, unsupported by specific evidence, that there was fraud in the election.
Bill Barr, on Election Day 2020, he was the Attorney General of the United States, the top law enforcement official in the country, telling the president exactly what he thought about claims of a stolen election. Donald Trump had his days in court to challenge the results. He was within his rights to seek those judgments. In the United States, law-abiding citizens have those tools for pursuing justice. He lost in the courts, just as he did at the ballot box. And in this country, That's the end of the line. But for Donald Trump, that was only the beginning of what became a sprawling, multi-step conspiracy aimed at overturning the presidential election, aimed at throwing out the votes of millions of Americans, your votes, your voice in our democracy, and replacing the will of the American people with his will to remain in power after his term ended. Donald Trump was at the center of this conspiracy, and ultimately, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, spurred a mob of domestic enemies of the Constitution to march down the Capitol and subvert American democracy. Any legal jargon you hear about seditious conspiracy, obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the United States boils down to this. January 6th was the culmination of an attempted coup, a brazen attempt, as one writer put it shortly after January 6th, to overthrow the government. The violence was no accident. It represented Trump's last stand, most desperate chance to halt the transfer of power. Now, you may hear those words and think, this is just another political attack on Donald Trump by people who don't like him. That's not the case. My colleagues and I all wanted an outside independent commission to investigate January 6th, similar to what we had after 9/11. But after first agreeing to the idea, Donald Trump's allies in Congress put a stop to it. Apparently, they don't want January 6th investigated at all. And in the last 17 months, many of those same people have tried to whitewash what happened on January 6th, to rewrite history, call it a tourist visit, label it legitimate political discourse. Donald Trump and his followers have adopted the words of the songwriter, "Do you believe me or your lying eyes?" We can't sweep what happened under the rug. The American people deserve answers. So I come before you this evening, not as a Democrat, but as an American who swore an oath to defend the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't protect just Democrats or just Republicans. It protects all of us, we the people. And this scheme was an attempt to undermine the will of the people. So tonight, and over the next few weeks, we're going to remind you of the reality of what happened that day. But our work must do much more than just look backwards. Because of our democracy remains in danger, the conspiracy to thwart the will of the people is not over. There are those in this audience who thirst for power but have no love or respect for what makes America great: devotion to the Constitution, allegiance to the rule of law, our shared journey to build a more perfect union. January 6th and the lies that led to insurrection have put 2.5 centuries of constitutional democracy at risk. The world is watching what we do here. America has long been expected to be a shining city on the hill, a beacon of hope and freedom, a model for others when we are at our best. How can we play that role when our house is in such disorder? We must confront the truth with candor, resolve, and determination. We need to show that we are worthy of the gifts that are the birthright of every American. That begins here, and it begins now, with a true accounting of what happened and what led to the attack on our Constitution and our democracy. In this moment, when the dangers of our Constitution and our democracy loom large, nothing could be more important. Working alongside the public servants on this dais has been one of the greatest honors of my time in Congress. It's been a particular privilege to count as a partner in this effort, and to count as a friend the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney. She is a patriot, a public servant of profound courage, of devotion to her oath and the Constitution. It's my pleasure to recognize Ms. Cheney for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me echo those words about the importance of bipartisanship and what a tremendous honor it is to work on this committee. Mr. Chairman, at 6:01 p.m. on January 6th, after he spent hours watching a violent mob besiege, attack, and invade our Capitol, Donald Trump tweeted, but he did not condemn the attack. Instead, he justified it. "These are the things and events that happen," he said, "when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who've been badly and unfairly treated for so long." As you will see in the hearings to come, President Trump believed his supporters at the Capitol, and I quote, "We're doing what they should be doing." This is what he told his staff as they pleaded with him to call off the mob, to instruct his supporters to leave. Over a series of hearings in the coming weeks, you will hear testimony, live and on video, from more than half a dozen former White House staff in the Trump administration, all of whom were in the West Wing of the White House on January 6th. You will hear testimony that, quote, "The president did not really want to put anything out calling off the riot or asking his supporters to leave." You will hear that President Trump was yelling and, quote, "really angry at advisors who told him he needed to be doing something more." And aware of the rioters' chance to hang Mike Pence, the president responded with this sentiment, quote, "Maybe our supporters have the right idea. Mike Pence, quote, deserves it." You will hear evidence that President Trump refused for hours to do what his staff, his family, and many of his other advisors begged him to do: immediately instruct his supporters to stand down and evacuate the Capitol. Tonight, you will see never-before-seen footage of the brutal attack on our Capitol, an attack that unfolded while a few blocks away, President Trump sat watching television in the dining room next to the Oval Office. You will hear audio from the brave police officers battling for their lives and ours, fighting to defend our democracy against a violent mob Donald Trump refused to call off. Tonight and in the weeks to come, you will see evidence of what motivated this violence, including directly from those who participated in this attack. You will see video of them explaining what caused them to do it. You will see their posts on social media. We will show you what they have said in federal court. On this point, there is no room for debate. Those who invaded our Capitol and battled law enforcement for hours were motivated by what President Trump had told them, that the election was stolen and that he was the rightful president. President Trump summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack. You will also hear about plots to commit seditious conspiracy on January 6th, a crime defined in our laws as conspiring to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, or to oppose by force the authority thereof. Multiple members of two groups, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, have been charged with this crime for their involvement in the events leading up to and on January 6th. Some have pled guilty. The attack on our Capitol was not a spontaneous riot. Intelligence available before January 6th identified plans to, quote, invade the Capitol, occupy the Capitol, and take other steps to halt Congress's count of electoral votes that day. In our hearings to come, we will identify elements of those plans, and we will show specifically how a group of Proud Boys led a mob into the Capitol building on January 6th. Tonight, I am going to describe for you some of what our committee has learned and highlight initial findings you will see this month in our hearings. As you hear this, all Americans should keep in mind this fact. On the morning of January 6th, President Donald Trump's intention was to remain President of the United States, despite the lawful outcome of the 2020 election and in violation of his constitutional obligation to relinquish power. Over multiple months, Donald Trump oversaw and coordinated a sophisticated 7-part plan to overturn the presidential election and prevent the transfer of presidential power. In our hearings, you will see evidence of each element of this plan. In our second hearing, you will see that Donald Trump and his advisors knew that he had in fact lost the election. But despite this, President Trump engaged in a massive effort to spread false and fraudulent information to convince huge portions of the US population that fraud had stolen the election from him. This was not true. Jason Miller was a senior Trump campaign spokesman. In this clip, Miller describes a call between the Trump campaign's internal data expert and President Trump a few days after the 2020 election.
I was in the Oval Office, and at some point in the conversation, Matt Oskowski, who is the lead data person, was brought on, and I remember he delivered to the president pretty blunt terms that he was going to lose.
And that was based, Mr. Miller, on Matt and the data team's assessment of the sort of county by county, state by state results as reported?
Correct.
Alex Cannon was one of President Trump's campaign lawyers. He previously worked for the Trump Organization. One of his responsibilities was to assess allegations of election fraud in November 2020. Here is one sample of his testimony discussing what he told White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows.
I remember a call with Mr. Meadows, where Mr. Meadows was asking me what I was finding and if I was finding anything. And I remember sharing with him that we weren't finding anything that would be sufficient to change the results in any of the key states.
When was that conversation?
Probably in November, mid to late November. I think it was before my child was born.
And what was Mr. Meadows' reaction to that information?
I believe the words he used were, "So there's no there there."
There's no there there. The Trump campaign's general counsel, Matt Morgan, gave similar testimony. He explained that all of the fraud allegations and the campaign's other election arguments taken together and viewed in the best possible light for President Trump could still not change the outcome of the election. President Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr also told Donald Trump his election claims were wrong.
Repeatedly told the president in no uncertain terms that I did not see evidence of fraud and that would have affected the outcome of the election. And frankly, a year and a half later, I haven't seen anything to change my mind on that.
Attorney General Barr also told President Trump that his allegations about Dominion voting machines were groundless.
I saw absolutely zero basis for the allegations, but they were made in such a sensational way that they obviously were influencing a lot of people, members of the public, that there was this systemic corruption in the system and that their votes didn't count and that these machines controlled by somebody else were actually determining it, which was complete nonsense. And it was being laid out there. And I told them that it was crazy stuff and they were wasting their time on that. And it was doing a grave disservice to the country.
But President Trump persisted, repeating the false Dominion allegations in public at least a dozen more times, even after his attorney general told him they were, quote, complete nonsense. And after Barr's resignation on December 23rd, the acting attorney general who replaced him, Jeff Rosen, and the acting deputy, Richard Donoghue, told President Trump over and over again that the evidence did not support allegations he was making in public. Many of President Trump's White House staff also recognized that the evidence did not support the claims President Trump was making. This is the president's daughter commenting on Bill Barr's statement that the department found no fraud sufficient to overturn the election.
How did that affect your perspective about the election when Attorney General Barr made that statement?
It affected my perspective. I respect Attorney General Barr. So I accepted what he was saying.
As you will hear on Monday, the president had every right to litigate his campaign claims, but he ultimately lost more than 60 cases in state and federal courts. The president's claims in the election cases were so frivolous and unsupported that the president's lead lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, not only lost the lawsuits, his license to practice law was suspended. Here's what the court said of Mr. Giuliani. Giuliani communicated demonstrably false and misleading statements to courts, lawmakers, and the public at large in his capacity as lawyer for former President Donald J. Trump and the Trump campaign in connection with Trump's failed effort at re-election in 2020. As you will see in great detail in our hearings, President Trump ignored the rulings of our nation's courts. He ignored his own campaign leadership, his White House staff, many Republican state officials. He ignored the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. President Trump invested millions of dollars of campaign funds purposely spreading false information, running ads he knew were false, and convincing millions of Americans that the election was corrupt and that he was the true president. As you will see, this misinformation campaign provoked the violence on January 6th. In our third hearing, you will see that President Trump corruptly planned to replace the Attorney General of the United States so the U.S. Justice Department would spread his false stolen election claims. In the days before January 6th, President Trump told his top Justice Department officials, quote, "Just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman." Senior Justice Department officials, men he had appointed, told him they could not do that because it was not true. So President Trump decided to replace them. He offered Jeff Clark, an environmental lawyer at the Justice Department, the job of acting Attorney General. President Trump wanted Mr. Clark to take a number of steps, including sending this letter to Georgia and 5 other states, saying the U.S. Department of Justice had, quote, identified significant concerns that may have impacted the outcome of the election. This letter is a lie. The Department of Justice had, in fact, repeatedly told President Trump exactly the opposite, that they had investigated his stolen election allegations and found no credible fraud that could impact the outcome of the election. This letter and others like it would have urged multiple states to withdraw their official and lawful electoral votes for Biden. Acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donoghue described Jeff Clark's letter this way, quote, "This would be a grave step for the department to take and could have tremendous constitutional, political, and social ramifications for this country." The committee agrees with Mr. Donoghue's assessment. Had Clark assumed the role of Attorney General in the days before January 6th and issued these letters, the ramifications could indeed have been grave. Mr. Donoghue also said this about Clark's plan.
And I recall toward the end saying, what you're proposing is nothing less than the United States Justice Department meddling in the outcome of a presidential election.
In our hearings, you will hear firsthand how the senior leadership of the Department of Justice threatened to resign, how the White House counsel threatened to resign, and how they confronted Donald Trump and Jeff Clark in the Oval Office. The men involved, including Acting Attorney General Jeff Rosen and Acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donoghue, were appointed by President Trump. These men honored their oaths of office, they did their duty, and you will hear from them in our hearings. By contrast, Jeff Clark has invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and refused to testify. Representative Scott Perry, who is also involved in trying to get Clark appointed as Attorney General, has refused to testify here. As you will see, Representative Perry contacted the White House in the weeks after January 6th to seek a presidential pardon. Multiple other Republican congressmen also sought presidential pardons for their roles in attempting to overturn the 2020 election. In our fourth hearing, we will focus on President Trump's efforts to pressure Vice President Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes on January 6th. Vice President Pence has spoken publicly about this.
President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. The presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone. And frankly, there is no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose the American president.
What President Trump demanded that Mike Pence do wasn't just wrong, it was illegal and it was unconstitutional. You will hear this in great detail from the Vice President's former general counsel. Witnesses in these hearings will explain how the former Vice President and his staff informed President Trump over and over again that what he was pressuring Mike Pence to do was illegal. As you will hear, President Trump engaged in a relentless effort to pressure Pence, both in private and in public. You will see the evidence of that pressure from multiple witnesses, live and on video. Vice President Pence demonstrated his loyalty to Donald Trump consistently over 4 years, but he knew that he had a higher duty to the United States Constitution. This is testimony from the Vice President's Chief of Staff.
So I think the Vice President was proud of his 4 years of service, and he felt like much had been accomplished in those 4 years. And I think he was proud to have stood beside the President for all that had been done. But I think he ultimately knew that his fidelity to the Constitution was his first and foremost oath. And that's what he articulated publicly, and I think that that's what he felt.
His fidelity to the Constitution was more important than his fidelity to President Trump and his desire.
The oath he took. Yep.
Yes.
You'll also hear about a lawyer named John Eastman. Mr. Eastman was deeply involved in President Trump's plans. You'll hear from former Fourth Circuit federal judge Michael Luttig, a highly respected leading conservative judge. John Eastman clerked for Judge Luttig. Judge Luttig provided counsel to the Vice President's team in the days before January 6th. The judge will explain how Eastman, quote, was wrong at every turn. And you will see the email exchanges between Eastman and the Vice President's counsel as the violent attack on Congress was underway. Mr. Jacob said this to Mr. Eastman: "Thanks to your bullshit, we are under siege." You will also see evidence that John Eastman did not actually believe the legal position he was taking. In fact, a month before the 2020 election, Eastman took exactly the opposite view on the same legal issues. In the course of the Select Committee's work to obtain information from Mr. Eastman, we have had occasion to present evidence to a federal judge. The judge evaluated the facts, and he reached the conclusion that President Trump's efforts to pressure Vice President Pence to act illegally by refusing to count electoral votes likely violated 2 federal criminal statutes. And the judge also said this: if Dr. Eastman and President Trump's plan had worked, it would have permanently ended the peaceful transition of power, undermining American democracy and the Constitution. If the country does not commit to investigating and pursuing accountability for those responsible, the court fears January 6th will repeat itself. Every American should read what this federal judge has written. The same judge, Judge Carter, issued another decision on Tuesday night, just this week, indicating that John Eastman and other Trump lawyers knew that their legal arguments had no real chance of success in court, but they relied on those arguments anyway to try to, quote, overturn a democratic election. And you will hear that while Congress was under attack on January 6th and the hours following the violence, the Trump legal team in the Willard Hotel War Room continued to work to halt the count of electoral votes. In our fifth hearing, you will see evidence that President Trump corruptly pressured state legislators and election officials to change election results. You will hear additional details about President Trump's call to Georgia officials, urging them to, quote, find 11,780 votes, votes that did not exist, and his efforts to get states to rescind certified electoral slates without factual basis and contrary to law. You will hear new details about the Trump campaign and other Trump associates' efforts to instruct Republican officials in multiple states to create intentionally false electoral slates and transmit those slates to Congress, to the Vice President, and the National Archives, falsely certifying that Trump won states he actually lost. In our final two June hearings, you will hear how President Trump summoned a violent mob and directed them illegally to march on the United States Capitol. While the violence was underway, President Trump failed to take immediate action to stop the violence and instruct his supporters to leave the Capitol. As we present these initial findings, keep 2 points in mind. First, our investigation is still ongoing, so what we make public here will not be the complete set of information we will ultimately disclose. And second, the Department of Justice is currently working with cooperating witnesses and has disclosed to date only some of the information it has identified from encrypted communications and other sources. On December 18, 2020, a group including General Michael Flynn, Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, and others visited the White House. They stayed late into the evening. We know that the group discussed a number of dramatic steps, including having the military seize voting machines and potentially rerun elections. You will also hear that President Trump met with that group alone for a period of time before White House lawyers and other staff discovered the group was there and rushed to intervene. A little more than an hour after Ms. Powell, Mr. Giuliani, General Flynn, and the others finally left the White House, President Trump sent the tweet on the screen now, telling people to come to Washington on January 6th. Be there, he instructed them. We'll be wild. As you will see, this was a pivotal moment. This tweet initiated a chain of events. The tweet led to the planning for what occurred on January 6th, including by the Proud Boys, who ultimately led the invasion of the Capitol and the violence on that day. The indictment of a group of Proud Boys alleges that they planned, quote, to oppose by force the authority of the government of the United States. And according to the Department of Justice, on January 6, 2021, the defendants directed, mobilized, and led members of the crowd onto the Capitol grounds and into the Capitol, leading to the dismantling of metal barricades, the destruction of property, the breaching of the Capitol building, and the assaults on law enforcement. Although certain former Trump officials have argued that they did not anticipate violence on January 6th, the evidence suggests otherwise. As you will see in our hearings, the White House was receiving specific reports in the days leading up to January 6th, including during President Trump's Ellipse rally, indicating that elements in the crowd were preparing for violence at the Capitol. And on the evening of January 5th, the president's close advisor, Steve Bannon, said this on his podcast.
All hell is going to break loose tomorrow. Just understand this. All hell is going to break loose tomorrow.
As part of our investigation, we will present information about what the White House and other intelligence agencies knew and why the Capitol was not better prepared. But we will not lose sight of the fact that the Capitol Police did not cause the crowd to attack. And we will not blame the violence that day, violence provoked by Donald Trump, on the officers who bravely defended all of us. In our final hearing, you will hear a moment-by-moment account of the hours-long attack from more than half a dozen White House staff, both live in the hearing room and via videotaped testimony. There's no doubt that President Trump was well aware of the violence as it developed. White House staff urged President Trump to intervene and call off the mob. Here is a document written while the attack was underway by a member of the White House staff advising what the president needed to say. Quote, anyone who entered the Capitol without proper authority should leave immediately. This is exactly what his supporters on Capitol Hill and nationwide were urging the president to do. He would not. You will hear that leaders on Capitol Hill begged the president for help, including Republican leader McCarthy, who was, quote, scared, and called multiple members of President Trump's family after he could not persuade the president himself. Not only did President Trump refuse to tell the mob to leave the Capitol, he placed no call to any element of the United States government to instruct that the Capitol be defended. He did not call his Secretary of Defense on January 6th. He did not talk to his Attorney General. He did not talk to the Department of Homeland Security. President Trump gave no order to deploy the National Guard that day, and he made no effort to work with the Department of Justice to coordinate and deploy law enforcement assets. But Vice President Pence did each of those things. For example, here is what General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified to this committee.
There were 2 or 3 calls with Vice President Pence. He was very animated, and he issued very explicit, very direct, unambiguous orders. There was no question about that, and I can get you the exact quotes, I guess, from some of our records somewhere. But he was very animated, very direct, very firm, and to Secretary Miller, get the military down here, get the Guard down here, put down this situation, etc.
By contrast, here is General Milley's description of his conversation with President Trump's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, on January 6th.
He said, we have to kill the narrative that the Vice President is making all the decisions. We need to establish the narrative that that the president is still in charge and that things are steady or stable or what's that thing. I immediately interpreted that as politics, politics, politics. Red flag for me personally, no action, but I remember it distinctly.
And you will hear from witnesses how the day played out inside the White House, how multiple White House staff resigned in disgust, and how President Trump would not ask his supporters to leave the Capitol. It was only after multiple hours of violence that President Trump finally released a video instructing the riotous mob to leave. And as he did so, he said to them, quote, "We love you, and you're very special." You will also hear that in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, members of the president's family, White House staff, and others tried to step in to stabilize the situation, quote, to land the plane before the presidential transition on January 20th. You will hear about members of the Trump cabinet discussing the possibility of invoking the 25th Amendment and replacing the President of the United States. Multiple members of President Trump's own cabinet resigned immediately after January 6th. One member of the cabinet suggested that the remaining cabinet officers needed to take a more active role in running the White House and the administration. But most emblematic of those days is this exchange of texts between Sean Hannity and former President Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany. Sean Hannity wrote, in part, "Key now, no more crazy people, no more stolen election talk. Yes, impeachment and 25th Amendment are real. Many people will quit." Ms. McEnany responded in part, "Love that. That's the playbook." The White House staff knew that President Trump was willing to entertain and use conspiracy theories to achieve his ends. They knew the president needed to be cut off from all of those who had encouraged him. They knew that President Donald Trump was too dangerous to be left alone, at least until he left office on January 20th. These are important facts for Congress and the American people to understand fully. When a president fails to take the steps necessary to preserve our union, or worse, causes a constitutional crisis, we're at a moment of maximum danger for our republic. Some in the White House took responsible steps to try to prevent January 6th. Others egged the president on. Others, who could have acted, refused to do so. In this case, the White House counsel was so concerned about potentially lawless activity that he threatened to resign multiple times. That is exceedingly rare and exceedingly serious. It requires immediate attention, especially when the entire team threatens to resign. However, in the Trump White House, it was not exceedingly rare, and it was not treated seriously. This is a clip of Jared Kushner addressing multiple threats by White House counsel Pat Cipollone and his team of lawyers to resign in the weeks before January 6th.
Jared, are you aware of instances where Pat Cipollone threatened to resign?
I kind of, like I said, my interest at that time was on trying to get as many pardons done. And I know that, he was always, him and the team were always saying, oh, we're going to resign. We're not going to be here if this happens, if that happens. So I kind of took it up to just be whining, to be honest with you.
Whining. There's a reason why people serving in our government take an oath to the Constitution. As our founding fathers recognized, democracy is fragile. People in positions of public trust are duty-bound to defend it, to step forward when action is required. In our country, we don't swear an oath to an individual or a political party. We take our oath to defend the United States Constitution. And that oath must mean something. Tonight, I say this to my Republican colleagues who are defending the indefensible. There will come a day when Donald Trump is gone, but your dishonor will remain. Finally, I ask all of our fellow Americans, as you watch our hearings over the coming weeks, please remember what's at stake. Remember the men and women who have fought and died so that we can live under the rule of law, not the rule of men. I ask you to think of the scene in our Capitol Rotunda on the night of January 6th. There, in a sacred space in our constitutional republic, the place where our presidents lie in state, watched over by statues of Washington and Jefferson, Lincoln and Grant, Eisenhower, Ford, and Reagan. Against every wall that night encircling the room, there were SWAT teams, men and women in tactical gear with long guns, deployed inside our Capitol building. There in the rotunda, these brave men and women rested beneath paintings depicting the earliest scenes of our republic, including one painted in 1824 depicting George Washington resigning his commission, voluntarily relinquishing power, handing control of the Continental Army back to Congress. With this noble act, Washington set the indispensable example of the peaceful transfer of power, what President Reagan called nothing less than a miracle. The sacred obligation to defend this peaceful transfer of power has been honored by every American president, except one. As Americans, we all have a duty to ensure that what happened on January 6th never happens again, to set aside partisan battles, to stand together to perpetuate and preserve our great republic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
As we provide answers to American people about January 6th, it's important that we remember exactly what took place. That this was no tourist visit to the Capitol. Most of the footage we are about to play has never been seen. The Select Committee obtained it as a part of our investigation. This isn't easy to watch. I want to warn everyone that this video includes violence and strong language. Without objection, I include in the record a video presentation of the violence of January 6th.
Proud of your boy! Proud of your boy! Proud of your boy!
Yeah, just for awareness, be advised, there's probably about 300 Proud Boys. They're marching eastbound in this 400 block of kind of Independence, actually on the mall towards the United States Capitol.
I am not allowed to say what's going to happen today because everyone's just going to have to watch for themselves. But it's going to happen. Something's going to happen.
Whose streets? Our streets! Whose streets? Our streets! Whose streets? Our streets! Hurt you. We are on your side. Don't make us go against you. I'm just picking a side. Pick a side. These are our streets.
$20 a picture.
I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify. And we become president, and you are the happiest people. Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
Cruiser 50, it does look like we're going to have an ad hoc march stepping off here. There's a crowd surge heading east.
We love Trump! 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 We love Trump!
Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now.
Get back, ladies! Get back, ladies!
It's 21 priority. We just had protesters. Peace circle, breach the line. We need backup.
Madam Speaker, the Vice President and the United States Senate.
We're going to give riot warnings as soon as the apparatus is here. We're going to give riot warnings. We're going to try to get compliance, but this is now effectively a riot.
49 hours declaring it a riot.
Cruiser 5 to 50, be advised, Cal Police 1 advised they're trying to breach and get to the Capitol.
50, I copy.
We're about 5 miles out. We're trying to make our way through all this.
We have a breach of the Capitol! Breach of the Capitol to the upper level!
Jack, be advised, they're requesting additional resources on the east side as they've broken into that window and they're trying to kick it in.
Without objection, the Chair declares the House in recess pursuant to Clause 12B of Rule 1.
Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. U.S. demands the truth. Bring out Pence. Bring out Pence. Bring out Pence.
We're gonna get too many fucking people here. Look at this fucking vantage point, man. We're fucked.
We need an area for the House members. They're all walking over now through the tunnels. We're trying to hold the upper deck. We're trying to hold the upper deck now. We need to hold the doors of the Capitol. I need court support. We lost the line. All MPDs pull back. All MPDs pull back up to the upper deck. All MPDs pull back to the upper deck. ASAP.
Cruiser 50, be advised that Capitol Police is going to start moving their resources inside. They're going to start the M4 officers first.
Okay, H208 with 4 members. The door's barricaded. There's people flooded the hallways outside. We have no way out.
In fact, officers still remaining on the House floor, on the third floor, to use the subways themselves. It's time to evacuate so we can secure the members on the other side. Copy.
It's up to us people now, the American people.
So what are you ready to do?
One more time.
What are you ready to do?
And whatever it takes, I'll lay my life down if it takes.
Absolutely. That's why we showed up today.
Bring her out! Bring her out here! Hey! We're coming in if you don't bring her out! Back up! Fuck you, son of a bitch! You back up! You back up! I have myself on back. Don't even try. Get him up! Get him up! Get him up! Officers down! Get him up! He wants to go! Hold on! Get him up! Hold up! Get him up! Hold up!
Jason Skaggs to send to that West Terran store for backup.
Pursuant to the order of the committee of tonight, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
And we've been watching absolutely stunning video of the mob attacking the Capitol building, beating police. These are some of this video we have seen, but so much of it we have not. And all that preceded by remarkable opening statements by Liz Cheney, one of the two Republicans on this House January 6th Select Committee. She followed the committee chair, Benny Thompson, Congressman from Mississippi. Simply a hold your breath hour we have just spent listening to the testimony, the statements from the chair, Benny Thompson, and from the ranking Republican, Liz Cheney, and then watching that video, which I am sure many of you have just been watching, very hard to stomach. And as the committee takes, as you heard Chairman Thompson say, just a short break, joining me at the table here at the NewsHour to help analyze all this, Mary McCord, who served as the acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security from 2016 to 2017. She now leads the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. With her, Paul Rosenzweig, a cybersecurity consultant who previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security and as Senior Counsel in the Whitewater investigation. That was back during President Clinton. And finally, Donnell Harvin, former head of Homeland Security and Intelligence for the District of Columbia. He is now a senior policy researcher with the RAND Corporation. Donnell Harvin, I'm going to start with you because we spoke with you on the NewsHour just a short time ago, just a few hours ago, and you were reminding us that you had evidence, saw warnings in the days leading up to this assault on the Capitol that this might happen. So this was not entirely a surprise to you.
Certainly not, but we didn't think it would unfold in the type of violence that we saw on that day. We knew that there were groups who were coming, some of which may be armed, many of which who had bad intentions to try to enter the Capitol. They were sharing plans to enter the Capitol. They were communicating even down to minute details, such as handheld radio frequencies. But the fact that they were able to effectively use a very worked up, riled up crowd effectively as a force multiplier is something that I don't think any of us could have predicted.
What did you see just now in that? That's what I wanted to know in watching this. I mean, someone with your trained eye, what did you see in the way this mob formed itself and then moved in on the Capitol? What we heard from members of the Proud Boys and these other groups about what they were doing there that day?
They projected all this online before they even got there on January 6th. We knew the Proud Boys had said that they were not going to be wearing their traditional colors. We knew that they were going to be wearing certain color hats as demarcation areas, using certain flags as rally points. And as the day unfolded, they were using military-style tactics, stacking phalanx maneuvers, flanking maneuvers. So there was a small group of very highly trained, highly organized individuals that once again used the mob effectively as a force multiplier. And so the video we just saw really justifies a lot of the intelligence that we collected and shared in the days leading up to January 6th, but certainly contextualizes what unfolded on that day as well.
And that, again, that video that we've been watching, just stomach churning to watch most of it. I think we're still absorbing what we've looked at, because even though some of this video was released, some of it we've seen, but so much of it we haven't, and certainly not in this kind of vivid detail. I want to bring in Mary McCord now, who has done a lot of work looking at these groups. But I also, Mary, I mean, this in a way is overshadowing what we heard prior to this, which was Congresswoman Liz Cheney of Wyoming, who has been one of the only Republicans to stand against her party and to denounce what's going on. And chapter and verse, she put together a narrative that is going to be a damning portrayal of President Trump's role in organizing all this.
This really was an opening statement, much like you would expect in a trial. I mean, I was a prosecutor for 20 years, and she went through, all of the efforts, the multi-step efforts to carry out, and she used this word, a coup, right? So starting with, the fact that Donald Trump was told by his own advisors that there was no evidence of fraud, the effort to co-opt the Department of Justice and including replacing those who disagreed with him with those who would carry out his duty, the intimidation of Mike Pence, the fraudulent elector scheme, and finally summoning the mob. And she really set the stage for what the Americans are going to see in the coming days. I think really trying to get people to say, I want to watch this. I'm tired of being told what to think. Yeah. I want to see the evidence for myself and make my own decisions.
Paul Rosenzweig is somebody who's been involved in organizing this kind of investigation here in Washington. What stands out from this how strong a presentation did you hear?
I think it was exceedingly powerful. I think what stands out to me, the arc of the story we sort of knew already, but what stands out to me was the way in which Congresswoman Cheney weaved in details, previously unknown details, that lend power and credence to the story in ways that ought to at least break through to the American people. That Bill Barr called the allegations of election fraud, am I allowed to say the word? Yeah. Quote him, bullshit, yeah. Right? That Ivanka Trump accepted Bill Barr's, that multiple Republican congressmen sought pardons. I mean, that's going to be the headline tomorrow, but really, what's amazing is that multiple Republican congressmen thought they needed pardons. That breaks through, or maybe it will break through.
Because of their involvement. Our Lisa Desjardins, who's been in the hearing room, is joining us now at the Capitol, along with Jeff Bennett at the White House. Lisa, I do want to quickly come to you. I have to say, we're all sitting here just taken, trying to take all this in and absorb it. A lot of it is new information.
That's right, and I think that in the hearing room, you could certainly see reporters very quickly taking a lot of notes. They were laying out, I think as Mary McCord said, almost a trial-like case against the former president. It struck me almost as sort of a different form of impeachment. It is not an impeachment proceeding, but they are making a case that this is a president who acted unlawfully and was at the center, as they say, of a conspiracy. I think I have to also tell you about the atmosphere in the room a little bit, as that long clip, I think a 12-minute long video, the last of the clips that they played was airing. I noticed in the back of the room, that's where there's about a little bit more than a dozen, almost maybe 18 members of Congress, all Democrats I saw back there. Many of them are members who I know were in the chamber on January 6th. I was watching them, and as that video went on, they were giving each other sort of steely-eyed glances. You could tell that they were feeling emotional, but telling each other, kind of giving each other silent support. And I saw one member, a freshman member, shaking, rocking back and forth, trying not to go to tears. It was a very emotional moment, I think, especially for those members of Congress who are in there. One going in said, I have to be here because I still don't have closure on that day yet. And you're feeling that in the room.
Yeah, no surprise. Jeff Bennett at the White House, I want to come to you for what is left of this break. We know President Biden is not in Washington tonight. He's been in California presiding over as the host of the Summit of the Americas, meeting with other leaders from the Western Hemisphere. But how closely is the White House following all this? How much stock do they put in what's going on?
Well, I'm told the White House Department of Legislative Affairs has been in close coordination and close touch with the House Speaker's office and also with leadership of the committee itself. But President Biden, I'm told, has kept a respectful distance from this committee and their work product, and that was intentional. In large part, the view from the White House is that for President Biden to offer some sort of running commentary about the many revelations about this committee's work that have come out, mainly through reporting, that would, in many ways, make this a partisan enterprise. Yeah. And this White House has also been very careful about not trying to be seen influencing or trying to pressure the Department of Justice or the Attorney General as they make their own determination about what cases to bring and when. I think it was particularly interesting to hear Congresswoman Liz Cheney to make note of the fact that there are cooperating witnesses who are working with the Department of Justice, which suggests that there's more to come on that front, Judy.
Jeff Bennett at the White House, and Jeff will be coming back to you a little later when this hearing ends, which we think will take place within the hour. It looks like Chairman Benny Thompson is back in his chair, and we want to go back to the committee as soon as they resume. They said that on this first night they plan to go somewhere between 90 minutes or so. Let's go right now to Chair Benny Thompson.
The committee will be in order. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us this evening to share their firsthand accounts of that terrible day. I know that some of the witnesses from our first hearing are in the room with us, along with some of the family members, friends, and widows of the officers who lost their lives as a result of the attack. Thank you all for being here for us and the American people. Officer Carolyn Edwards has been with the United States Capitol Police since 2017. On January 6th, Officer Edwards was assigned to the First Responder Unit, which serves as the first line of defense at the Capitol complex. She also served as a member of the Civil Disturbance Unit, a special subset of the uniformed division trained to respond to mass demonstration events. Officer Edwards is a graduate of the University of Georgia and currently is working on a master's degree in intelligence analysis from Johns Hopkins University. Nick Quistad is an acclaimed filmmaker whose credits include documenting stories from war zones in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. On January 6th, Mr. Quistad was working on a documentary about, quote, why Americans are so divided when Americans have so much in common, end quote. During that day, Mr. Quistad interviewed and documented movements of the people around the Capitol, including the first moments of the violence against the Capitol Police and the chaos that ensued. I will now swear in our witnesses. The witnesses will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear and affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Without objection, the witness's statement will be included in the record. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I recognize myself for questioning. As you saw just a few minutes ago, the Proud Boys instigated the first breach of the Capitol just before 1:00 p.m., where rioters pushed over barricades near the Peace Circle at the foot of the Capitol. Our two witnesses tonight were both there at the time of that first breach. Officer Edwards was standing with other officers behind a line of bike racks that marked the perimeter of the Capitol grounds. She bravely tried to prevent an angry crowd from advancing on the Capitol. Unfortunately, she was overrun and knocked unconscious as the crowd advanced on the Capitol. Mr. Quickstead was a few yards away from Officer Edwards, taking footage of the Proud Boys as part of his work on a documentary film. Most of his footage has never been shown publicly before we shared it this evening. Officer Edwards, I'd like to start by asking if you could tell us why you believe it's important for you to share your story this evening with the committee and the American public. Please, your microphone.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it, and thank you to the committee for having me here to testify. I was called a lot of things on January 6, 2021 and the days thereafter. I was called Nancy Pelosi's dog, called incompetent, called a hero, and a villain. I was called a traitor to my country, my oath, and my Constitution. In actuality, I was none of those things. I was an American, standing face to face with other Americans, asking myself how many times, many times, how we had gotten here. I had been called names before, but never had my patriotism or duty been called into question. I, who got up every day, no matter how early the hour or how late I got in the night before, to put on my uniform and to protect America's symbol of democracy. I, who spent countless hours in the baking sun and freezing snow to make sure that America's elected officials were able to do their job. I, whose literal blood, sweat, and tears were shed that day defending the building that I spent countless holidays and weekends working in. I am the proud granddaughter of a Marine that fought in the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in the Korean War. I think of my papa often in these days, how he was so young and thrown into a battle he never saw coming and answered the call at a great personal cost. How he lived the rest of his days with bullets and shrapnel in his legs, but never once complained about his sacrifice. I would like to think that he would be proud of me, proud of his granddaughter that stood her ground that day and continued fighting, even though she was wounded, like he did many years ago. I am my grandfather's granddaughter, proud to put on a uniform and serve my country. They dared to question my honor. They dared to question my loyalty. And they dared to question my duty. I am a proud American, and I will gladly sacrifice everything to make sure that the America my grandfather defended is here for many years to come. Thank you.
Officer Edwards, your story and your service is important, and I thank you for being here tonight. Ms. Quickstead, I also like to ask you to introduce yourself. Can you tell us how you found yourself in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021?
Good evening, Chair and Madam Vice Chair. Thank you for the introduction. As stated, in the winter of 2020, I was working on a documentary. As part of that documentary, I filmed several rallies in Washington, D.C. on December the 11th and December the 12th. And I learned there would be a rally on the Mall on January 6th. So my 3 colleagues and I came down to document the rally. According to the permit of the event, there was going to be a rally at the Ellipse. We arrived at the mall and observed a large contingent of Proud Boys marching towards the Capitol. We filmed them, and almost immediately I was separated from my colleagues. I documented the crowd turn from protesters to rioters to insurrectionists. I was surprised at the size of the group, the anger and the profanity. And for anyone who didn't understand how violent that event was, I saw it, I documented it, and I experienced it. I heard incredibly aggressive chanting, and I subsequently shared that footage with the authorities. I'm here today pursuant to a House subpoena. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Quested. The Select Committee has conducted extensive investigative work to understand what led the Proud Boys and other rioters to the Capitol on January 6th. We've obtained substantial evidence showing that the president's December 19th tweet calling his followers to Washington, D.C. on January 6th energized individuals from the Proud Boys and other extremist groups. I'd like to play a brief video highlighting some of this evidence.
My name is Marcus Childress, and I'm an investigative counsel for the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
White
name.
supremacists and
Who would
right
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
After he made this comment, Enrique Tarrio, then chairman of the Proud Boys, said on Parler, "Standing by, sir." During our investigation, we learned that this comment during the presidential debate actually led to an increase in membership from the Proud Boys.
Would you say that Proud Boys numbers increased after the stand back, stand by comment?
Exponentially. I'd say tripled probably, with the potential for a lot more eventually.
And did you ever sell any stand back and stand by merchandise?
One of the vendors on my page actually beat me to it, but I wish I would have made a stand back, stand by shirt.
On December 19th, President Trump tweeted about the January 6th rally and told attendees, "Be there, we'll be wild." Many of the witnesses that we interviewed were inspired by the president's call and came to D.C. for January 6th. But the extremists, they took it a step further. They viewed this tweet as a call to arms. A day later, the Department of Justice describes how the Proud Boys created a chat called the Ministry of Self-Defense Leadership Chat. In this chat, the Proud Boys established a command structure in anticipation of coming back to D.C. on January 6th. The Department of Justice describes Mr. Tarrio coming into possession of a document called the 1776 Returns, which describes individuals occupying key buildings around the United States Capitol. The Oath Keepers are another group that the committee investigated.
You better get your ass to D.C., folks, this Saturday.
Yeah, if you don't, there'll be no more Republic. But we're not going to let that happen. It's not even an if. It's either President Trump is encouraged and bolstered, strengthened to do what he must do, or we wind up in a bloody fight. We all know that. The fight's coming.
The Oath Keepers began planning to block the peaceful transfer of power shortly after the November 3rd election. And according to the Department of Justice, Stewart Rhodes, the Oath Keepers leader, said to his followers that we were not going to get through this without a civil war. In response to the December 19th, 2020 tweet by President Trump, the Oath Keepers focused on January 6th in Washington, D.C. In response to the tweet, one member, the president of the Florida chapter, put on social media, "The president called us to the Capitol. He wants us to make it wild." The goal was for the Oath Keepers to be called to duty so that they could keep the president in power, although President Trump had just lost the election. The committee learned that the Oath Keepers set up quick reaction forces outside of the city in Virginia where they stored arms. The goal of these quick reaction forces was to be on standby just in case President Trump invoked the Insurrection Act.
Did the Oath Keepers ever provide weapons to members?
I'm going to decline to answer that on Fifth Amendment grounds and due process grounds.
In footage obtained by the committee, we learned that on the night of January 5th, Enrique Tarrio and Stewart Rhodes met in a parking garage in Washington, D.C.
There's mutual respect there. I think we're fighting the same fight, and I think that's what's important.
The committee learned that the Oath Keepers went into the Capitol through the east doors in two stack formations. The DOJ alleges that one of the stacks went into the Capitol looking for Speaker Pelosi, although they never found her. As the attack was unfolding, Mr. Tarrio took credit. In documents obtained by the Department of Justice, Mr. Tarrio said in an encrypted chat, "Make no mistake, and we did this." Later on that evening, Mr. Tarrio even posted a video which seemed to resemble him in front of the Capitol with a black cape, and the title of the video was Premonition. The evidence developed by the Select Committee and the Department of Justice highlights how each group participated on the attack on the Capitol on January 6th.
In fact, the investigation revealed that it was individuals associated with the Proud Boys who instigated the initial breach at the Peace Circle at 12:53 p.m.
Within 10 minutes, rioters had already filled the Lower West Plaza. By 2 o'clock, rioters had reached the doors on the West and the East Plazas. And by 2:13, rioters had actually broken through the Senate wing door and gotten into the Capitol building. A series of breaches followed. At 2:25 p.m., rioters breached the east side doors to the Rotunda. And then right after 2:40 p.m., rioters breached the east side doors near the Ways and Means room. Once the rioters infiltrated the Capitol, they moved through the crypt, the Rotunda, the hallways leading to the House chambers, and even inside the Senate chambers.
Individuals associated with two violent extremist groups have been charged with seditious conspiracy in connection with the January 6th attack. One is the Oath Keepers. They are a group of armed anti-government extremists. The other group is the Proud Boys. They promote white supremacist beliefs and have engaged in violence with people they view as their political enemies. Members of both groups have already pled guilty to crimes associated with the January 6th attack. Mr. Quested, as part of the documentary you've been filming, you gained access to the Proud Boys and their leader, Enrique Tarrio. Your crew filmed them in Washington, D.C. on the evening of January 5th and then on January 6th. On January 5th, the night before the attack, you were with the head of the Proud Boys, Mr. Tarrio, in Washington, D.C. What happened?
We picked up Mr. Tarrio from jail. He'd been arrested for carrying some magazines, some extra capacity magazines, and he took responsibility for the burning of the Black Lives Matter flag that was stolen from the church on December the 12th. We were attempting to get an interview with Mr. Tarrio. We had no idea of any of the events that were going to subsequently happen. We drove him to pick up his bags from the property department of the police, which is just south of the mall. We picked up his bags and went to get some other bags from the Phoenix Hotel, where we encountered Mr. Stewart Rhodes from the Oath Keepers. By the time I'd gone to park the car, my colleague was saying, who'd got into the car with Mr. Tarrio, that they had moved to a location around the corner, the parking garage of the Hall of Legends, I believe. And so we quickly drove over there. We drove down into the parking garage and filmed the scene of Mr. Tarrio and Mr. Rhodes and certain other individuals in that garage. We then continued to follow Mr. Tarrio. There was some discussion about where he was going to go. He ended up going towards a hotel in Baltimore, and we conducted an interview with him in the hotel room. And then we returned to DC for that night. And what was interesting that night, actually, was that was the first indication that DC was much more busy than it had been any other time we'd been here, because we couldn't get into the hotels we wanted to, and we ended up at a hotel that, you know, was not as satisfactory as we would hoped.
Thank you. So what you're saying is you filmed the meeting between Mr. Tarrio and Oath Keepers leader Stewart Rhodes, right?
Indeed.
You couldn't hear what was said, but according to the Justice Department indictment of Mr. Tarrio, a participant referenced the Capitol. Now, on the morning of January 6th, you learned the Proud Boys would gather near the rally scheduled to take place near the White House. What time did you meet up with the Proud Boys, and what was happening when they met?
We met up with the Proud Boys somewhere around 10:30 a.m., and they were starting to walk down the mall easterly direction towards the Capitol. There was a large contingent, more than I had expected, and I was confused to a certain extent why we were walking away from the president's speech, because that's what I felt we were there to cover.
So at 10:30 a.m., that's early in the day. That's even before President Trump had started speaking. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
So how many Proud Boys would you estimate were marching together to the Capitol?
A couple of hundred, potentially. Yeah, I'd say a couple of hundred Proud Boys were marching towards the Capitol at that point.
At the time, was the area heavily guarded?
No, that was, I remember we walked we walked down the mall, we walked to the right of the reflecting pool, and then north along the road that leads to the Peace Circle. And as we were walking past the Peace Circle, I framed the Proud Boys to the right of my shot with the Capitol behind, and we see one sole police officer at the barriers, which subsequently breached. We then walk up and past a tactical unit preparing, and you see that in the film where the man questions their duty and their honor, and you see maybe a dozen Capitol Police putting on their riot gear.
So how would you describe the atmosphere at that time?
The atmosphere it seemed to be much darker. I make efforts to create a familiarity between myself and my subjects to make them feel comfortable. And the atmosphere was much darker this day than had been in these other days. And there was also a contingent of Proud Boys that I hadn't met before from Arizona who appeared to wear these orange hats and had orange armbands.
So when the Proud Boys went back down the hill to the Peace Circle, did a larger crowd start together?
Well, no. First of all, we went round to the back and down the steps, and we took some photographs on the east side of the Capitol, and then we went for lunch. We went for tacos.
So, Mr. Questa, you're a journalist, so you're careful to stick to things that you have observed. But what you've told us is highly relevant. Let me highlight a few key facts that you and others have provided the committee. First, there was a large group of Proud Boys present at the Capitol. We know that from multiple sources. You now estimate that there were around 250 to 300 individuals that you've testified. They weren't there for President Trump's speech. We know this because they left that area to march toward the Capitol before the speech began. They walked around the Capitol that morning. I'm concerned this allowed them to see what defenses were in place and where weaknesses might be. And they decided to launch their attack at the Peace Circle, which is the front door of the Capitol complex. It's the first security perimeter that those marching from the ellipse would have to come to as they moved toward the Capitol. The Peace Circle walkway was always where the thousands of angry Trump supporters would arrive after President Trump sent them from the lips. The Proud Boys timed their attack to the moments before the start of the joint session in the Capitol, which is also where President Trump directed the angry mob, quote, "We fight like hell," end quote. He told them before sending them down Pennsylvania Avenue, right to where the Proud Boys gathered and where you were filming. Now, a central question is whether the attack on the Capitol was coordinated and planned. What you witnessed is what a coordinated and planned effort would look like. It was the culmination of a months-long effort spearheaded by President Trump. Mr. Quested, thank you for your eyewitness account of the lead up to the breach of the Peace Circle. This brings us to a point in time where you and Officer Edwards were in close proximity. At this point, I reserve the balance of my time pursuant to 5C, Section 8 of House Resolution 503. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Officer Edwards, I want to start by thanking you for your service and thank you for your courage. Thank you for being here this evening. I know that it's not easy to relive what happened for you and for the officers behind you and for the family members of officers in the audience this evening. But it's really important for the country to have a full accounting and understand what happened. I want to start, Officer Edwards, with a short clip that shows the horrible moment when you were injured as the Peace Circle was breached. Officer Edwards, can you describe the crowd that had assembled at the Peace Circle as you and your fellow officers stood behind and guarded the bike racks at the Peace Circle?
Yes, so there were about, I want to say about 5 of us on that line. And there was our bike rack, and then at the bottom of the Pennsylvania Avenue walkway, or right by Peace Circle, there was another bike rack. And so the crowd had kind of gathered there. It was the crowd led by Joseph Biggs, and they were mostly in civilian clothes. There were some who had military fatigues on. We could see people with bulletproof vests on, things like that. They didn't seem, extremely cohesive, but they had gathered there in their outfits, but they had gathered there together, and Joseph Biggs started, he had a megaphone, and he started talking about, first it was things kind of relating to Congress, and then the tables started turning once the, what is now the Arizona group is what you said, the crowd with orange hats, they came up chanting F-U-C-K, Antifa, and they joined that group. And once they joined that group, Joseph Biggs' rhetoric turned to the Capitol Police. He started asking us questions like, you didn't miss a paycheck during the pandemic. Mentioning stuff about our pay scale was mentioned. And, started turning the tables on us. And I've worked I can, conservatively say probably hundreds of civil disturbance events. I know when I'm being turned into a villain, and that's when I turned to my sergeant and I stated the understatement of the century. I said, Sarge, I think we're gonna need a few more people down here. And so after that, I think they started conferring. They went a little silent. They started conferring among each other. I saw the person now identified as Ryan Samsel. He put his arm around Joseph Biggs, and they were talking, and then they started approaching the first barricade. They ripped the first barricade down, and they approached our bike racks. At that time, we started holding on, grabbing the bike racks. There weren't many of us, so I grabbed the middle between two different bike racks. And, I wasn't under any pretense that I could hold it for very long, but I just wanted to, make sure that we could get more people down and get our CDU units time to answer the call. So we started grappling over the bike racks. I felt the bike rack come on top of my head, and I was pushed backwards, and my foot caught the stair behind me, and my chin hit the handrail, and then at that point I had blacked out, but the back of my head clipped the concrete stairs behind me.
And you were knocked unconscious, is that right, Officer Edwards?
Yes, ma'am.
But then when you regained consciousness, even with the injuries, you returned to duty, is that right?
Yes, ma'am. At that time, adrenaline kicked in. I ran towards the West Front, and I tried to hold the line at the Senate steps at the Lower West Terrace. More people kept coming at us. It just seemed like, more and more people started, coming onto the West Front. They started overpowering us. And that was right about when MPD's officers showed up. Their bike officers pushed the crowd back and allowed our CDU units, as well as theirs, to form that line that you see, that very thin line between us and the protesters or the rioters, at that time. I fell behind that line, and for a while, I started decontaminating people who had gotten sprayed and treating people medically who needed it.
And then you were injured again there on the West Terrace, is that right, Officer Edwards?
Yes, ma'am. So after a while, I got back on the line. It was on the house side of the Lower West Terrace. And I was holding that line for a while. There weren't many of us over there. And Officer Sicknick was behind me for most of the time, for about 30 to 45 minutes that I was down there. We were just, as the best we could, we were just, grappling over bike racks and trying to hold them as quick as possible. All of a sudden, I see movement to the left of me, and I turned, and it was Officer Sicknick with his head in his hands. And he was ghostly pale, which I figured at that point that he had been sprayed, and I was concerned. My, cop alarm bells went off, because if you get sprayed with pepper spray, you're going to turn red. He turned just about as pale as this sheet of paper. And so I looked back to see what had hit him, what had happened, and that's when I got sprayed in the eyes as well. I was taken to be decontaminated by another officer, but we didn't get the chance because we were then tear gassed.
And we are going to play just a brief clip of that moment that you've just described, Officer Edwards. Officer Edwards, I just want to thank you for being here. And I know, again, how difficult it is. I know the family of Officer Sicknick as well, who's here tonight. One of the things one of the Capitol Police officers said to me recently was to ask me whether or not, as members of Congress, all of us understood that on that day, on January 6th, when we were evacuated from the chamber, were led to a safe, undisclosed location, whether we knew that so many of you had rushed out of the building and into the fight. And I can assure you that we do know that, and that we understand how important your service is. Thank you for your continued work with our committee and the interviews, and thank you very much for both of you for being here this evening. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Edwards, can you give us one memory of that awful day that stands out most vividly in your mind?
I can. That time when I talked about falling behind MPD's line, I remember because I had been kind of shielded away because I was holding those stairs, so I wasn't able to really see what was going on over here. When I fell behind that line and I saw, I can just remember my breath catching in my throat because what I saw was just a war scene. It was something like I had seen out of the movies. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were officers on the ground, you know, they were bleeding, they were throwing up, they were, you know, they had, I mean, I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood. You know, I was catching people as they fell. You know, it was carnage. It was chaos. I can't even describe what I saw. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that as a police officer, as a law enforcement officer, I would find myself in the middle of a battle. You know, I'm trained to detain, you know, a couple of subjects and handle a crowd, but I'm not combat trained. And that day, it was just hours of hand-to-hand combat, hours of dealing with things that were way beyond any law enforcement officer has ever trained for. And I just remember that moment of stepping behind the line and just seeing the absolute war zone that the West Front had become.
Let me thank you for your service and obviously your bravery that you have told the world about tonight. It's unfortunate that you had to defend the Capitol from fellow Americans. None of us would ever think that that would have to happen, but it did. So let me thank our witnesses for joining us tonight and sharing their experiences with America. Throughout my chairmanship of this committee, I've continuously vowed that this committee will ensure a comprehensive account of the heroic acts on January 6th, and that we will follow the facts wherever they lead. Your testimony is an essential part of that record and helps us do our job. Mr. Quested, thank you for sharing your footage and your account of the day's events with us. The images you recorded and have shared with the committee do a better job than any of our words in reinforcing the violence of January 6th. We hope that the power of your footage help encourage all Americans to consider how citizens with so much in common could viciously brawl at the seat of their democratic government. Officer Edwards, thank you for your brave service, as I indicated, on January 6th, and all you did to protect us, and most importantly, our democracy. If you and your fellow officers hadn't held the line against those violent insurrectionists, we can only imagine the disaster that would have ensued. Your heroism in the face of danger is admirable, and your will to continue to protect and serve despite your serious injuries should be an inspiration to all of us. We wish you a continued recovery and look forward to seeing you back in uniform sometime soon. The members of the Select Committee may have additional questions for tonight's witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objections, members will be permitted 10 business days to submit statements for the record, including opening remarks and additional questions for the witnesses. The witnesses have just told us what they heard the rioters saying while they stormed the Capitol on that day. Now we're going to hear it from the rioters themselves. Without objection, I include in the record a video presentation.
What really made me want to come was the fact that, I had supported Trump all that time. I did believe, that the election was being stolen. And Trump asked us to come.
He personally asked for us to come to D.C. that day. And I thought, for everything he's done for us, if this is the only thing he's going to ask of me, I'll do it.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Did you recall President Trump mentioning going to the Capitol during his speech?
Oh, yeah. So that's one of my disappointments. He said he was going to go and go with us, that he was going to be there.
I know why I was there, and that's because he called me there, and he laid out what is happening in our government. He laid it out.
But I remember Donald Trump telling people to be there, right? I mean, to support.
So you mentioned that the president asked you. Do you remember a specific message?
Basically, yeah, he asked for us to come to D.C., that big things are going to happen.
What got me interested, he said, I have something very important to say on January 6th or something like that, is what got me interested to be there.
Trump has only asked me for two things. He asked me for my vote, and he asked me to come on January 6th.
When the committee reconvenes next week, we're going to examine the lies that convinced those men and others to storm the Capitol, to try to stop the transfer of power. We're going to take a close look at the first part of Trump's attack on the rule of law, when he hit the fuse that ultimately resulted in the violence of January 6th. Without objection, and with that, the committee stands adjourned.
Mary. And with that, Chairman Benny Thompson wraps up this first night of public hearings of the January 6th committee with some absolutely jaw-dropping video of the storming of the Capitol, statements by the extremist groups, members of the Proud Boys, of the Oath Keepers. Joining me now, the analysts who've been watching with us here at our PBS NewsHour live coverage for the entire evening, Mary McCord, Paul Rosenzweig, and Donell Harvin. Mary, I want to come to you first because you follow what these extremist groups do. What did you see and hear tonight that added to your understanding of what happened?
Well, I saw them carrying out the things that they'd really been planning and thinking about. You know, Stewart Rhodes, even during the first impeachment, talked about very publicly about hoping the Donald Trump would call forth the Oath Keepers back then in the event he should be impeached, and they would come to his service. And he's been, you know, wanting to do this all along. So this gave them that chance to, you know, answer that call and come to the Capitol and try to actually halt the counting of the Electoral College vote, try to ensure that Donald Trump remained president.
And Donell Harvin also joining us, watching all of this. Again, you were you were the head of Homeland Security for the District of Columbia. You were seeing clues leading up to January 6th that this was going to happen, and now you've seen them executed in this video.
Absolutely. First of all, wow, that was riveting. The interesting parts that I picked up were the fact that the committee clearly laid out a few things that I think the viewers should take away from this. One, this wasn't just some disorganized group of individuals who are opportunists. The intelligence supports what we saw on the ground on January 6th. They were planning this for weeks, and that played out just as they wanted it to. The other thing is that this wasn't just a small group of bad apples, or some elected officials have said that it was just a normal tour. These individuals came prepared for war. You heard the officer talk about sustained, hours-long hand-to-hand combat, something that they're not trained for and something that we would never think that we would see in the steps of the Capitol.
It was just stunning, jarring, as you said. Paul Rosenzweig, to you quickly, because we're approaching 10 o'clock in the East. Put it all together tonight. What does it add up to?
Well, what I think it adds up to is the outlines of an indictment of Donald Trump. It's not a criminal indictment, but an indictment of responsibility. I think the most effective thing for me was the ending. The members of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers saying, I came because my leader called me and said, I want you to be there. And that's something that Trump is going to have to own, and I hope it's something that the American people understand was a deliberate action, or seems to have been.
And Lisa Desjardins at the Capitol, inside the hearing room. Is it your sense that the committee has gotten this started the way they wanted to tonight?
I think so. I'm interested to get the reaction of people after this, but you know, we know that one of our producers spoke to Pramila Jayapal, the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. She told us that she does think that this is off to a very strong start. She seemed to say that she doesn't understand how anyone couldn't be affected by what was said in there tonight. This was a very methodical hearing. I wasn't sure how much Hollywood we were going to get in this kind of hearing. We'd heard a lot about the production value of it, but there still was a very methodical and kind of slow pace as the committee was leading people through their conclusions. And one thing that really stood out to me, Judy, was not just this idea that the committee is indicting former President Trump in the court of public opinion here, but you talk about Trump and his role on January 6th is one thing. They also said a lot about the idea that the election was stolen, building their case that that was a lie told by President Trump, that it was a lie he knew was a lie, and that people around him knew was a lie. To me, that is important because covering the Capitol here every day, that is a piece of modern politics hour by hour. It's a part of what's happening now in this Capitol. That still idea, that lie that the election was stolen is very much present. Many Americans still believe that this was an election that had a large amount of fraud. And the committee attacking that, I thought, was significant.
A lie that lives very much
right.
in the halls of the Capitol and around the United States. And finally, just quickly to you, Jeff Bennett at the White House, President Biden in California tonight, but this administration has to be watching what's going on in these hearings very closely.
Absolutely. And I'm also struck by the degree to which Attorney General Merrick Garland will, in many ways, really just have to face the immense public pressure that would come from the mountain of evidence that was revealed tonight and that will come forward in the weeks to come. We knew going into this hearing that the committee made the case that what happened on January 6th did not happen in a vacuum, that it was part of a coordinated conspiracy, a criminal conspiracy, to take the words of some of the committee members. What we learned tonight, just from the sort of outlaying of evidence, is that President Trump, according to the committee, sat at the very center of it. It was part of a 7-point plot, to use the phrase that we heard from Congresswoman Liz Cheney. So one wonders that by the time we get to the end of these hearings, what will come of it?
Very clearly beginning to build the case that this committee is trying to make for the American people. Jeff Bennett at the White House, Lisa Desjardins at the Capitol. We're joined by our analyst, Paul Rosenzweig, Mary McCord, and Donnell Harvin. Thank you all very much for your analysis tonight. We appreciate it. And that does conclude our coverage of the first day of public hearings on the January 6th attack. The next hearing is scheduled for this coming Monday. That's June the 13th. That will be in the morning, 10 a.m. We'll have live coverage here on PBS. We're now going to return you to your regularly scheduled PBS programming in progress. For all of us at the NewsHour, I'm Judy Woodruff. Thank you. Please stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.